Hello, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this very timely discussion. We'll be taking questions from the audience, so I encourage everyone, if they have a question, to submit it in the questions box at the bottom of your screen. Our panelists today include Bethany Allen Ibrahimian, the China reporter at Axios. She's written on the subject of Chinese disinformation and was the lead journalist on the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists China Cable's Document Leak project. We're also joined by Sarah Cook, Senior Research Analyst for China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan at Freedom House. She's written extensively on the Chinese media, including the recent report, Beijing's Global Megaphone, the expansion of Chinese Communist Party media influence since 2017. We also have Reihan Asat, an attorney and president of the American Turkic International Lawyers Association. She's currently campaigning for the release of her brother, Ekber Asat, since his disappearance into the state detention system. And finally, we have Dr. Teng Yao, an academic lawyer and human rights activist. He's currently Grove Human Rights Scholar at Hunter College. Before we turn to our panelists, I'd like to very briefly discuss and introduce UHRP's latest report, The Happiest Muslims in the World, Disinformation, Propaganda, and the Uyghur Crisis. In it, we document the evolution of the narrative in Chinese state media on the Uyghur human rights crisis. The mass detention of Uyghurs began in 2016 and escalated throughout 2017. However, little about what was happening appeared in the official Chinese media, although there were documents that were appearing on the internet that revealed some information about what was going on. Throughout 2017, these postings were deleted and secrecy was maintained. And Chinese officials, whenever they were asked about the situation, maintained denial about what was going on. In August of 2017, a Chinese official said that people in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region were the happiest Muslims in the world. At the UN in August of 2018, at the third review, the Hu Lianhe, the representative of China, said there was no such thing as re-education centers, and this marked a major turning point in the evolution of the narrative. From there, the Chinese media began reporting on the situation, mostly in a way that was directed at an international audience. They began framing it as a solution to extremism, offering people vocational training in these facilities, which might be more accurately termed concentration camps. So the Chinese government has gone from silence to promoting its policies as a model with dangerous implications for human rights worldwide. A number of journalists and diplomats were taken to the camps, which had been refitted to look less like detention facilities. And now we are seeing a huge uptick in the amount of propaganda that's being produced by the Chinese state media, mostly in response to the much more elevated level of attention that's being placed on the issue. So with that, I would like to turn to our panel to get their thoughts on this subject. We'll begin with Bethany. So turning it over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Nicole, and thank you for this report, which is really a big help in our understanding of the information environment that we have been observing and dealing with and interacting with and pushing back against for the past 3 years. I mean, really longer than that, but you know, as you've laid out so well in the report, this almost overwhelming deluge of disinformation, of propaganda from across the Chinese state and the Chinese Communist Party has been in some cases quite difficult to parse and to comprehend. So I would say that one big contribution of this report is to find a thread going through it and tracing out, these are the departments that were involved, this was how they did it, and these were these strategies. So this is a big help, I think, as we understand this. There's just a few parts that I want to highlight that caught my eye that I thought were particularly important and particularly interesting. And the first one is early on, the report mentions the role of the United Front Work Department and mentions that in 2017, the United Front Work Department's control of the Ethnic and Religious Affairs, the Ethnic and Religious Affairs Bureau, which was previously a government bureau. So this was transferred from a government organ to the United Front Work Department, which is a party organ. This was part of a larger reorganization of the party. You could say that it was in 2017, the party ate the state. And I think that's important because it helps us understand that what has been happening to the Uyghurs, while unique to the Uyghurs, stems from a larger phenomenon occurring in China, driven very heavily by Xi Jinping, which is his obsession with control, his obsession with the leadership of the party and the central control of the party. And so the fact that the United Front Work Department, a party organ, was given direct control of the State Administration for Religious Affairs and the State Ethnic Affairs Commission it demonstrates that what we're seeing in Xinjiang is part of a larger pathology, really, that is affecting the entire Chinese state. And also in 2017, the central government established the Xinjiang Bureau of the United Front Work Department. So the United Front Work Department is what it does is political influence. It tries to make sure that everyone outside of the party is involved and actively participating in the goals of the party, and that's both true inside of China and outside of China. And I want to kind of demonstrate how that kind of thinking, United Front thinking, has affected all of China's approach about its messaging and its strategy related to the mass internment camps, the genocide occurring in Xinjiang, and how that it is being presented to the world. And the example I'd like to use happened recently, last year. I believe it was last year, there were two warring letters in the United Nations. So one letter was signed by 20 some odd countries, was opposed to stating their opposition to what was happening in China, and 20 some odd countries sent a letter to the UN saying that they supported what China was doing, its efforts in counterterrorism. And those countries that supported China, almost all of them were involved with China's Belt and Road, which is China's foreign policy. And this kind of concept that everyone must align with China's goals is very much a concept related to the United Front Work Department. So we see these kinds of messaging strategies at the most local levels in Xinjiang, on the ground, at a national level, at an international level, and even integrated into China's foreign policy. And one other just small part of the report that I would like to also highlight is, because it's been in the news recently, it's been an ongoing theme, is the Chinese government's attempts to discredit the people who are doing the most to shine a light on these gross human rights violations. And one person I'd like to mention is Adrian Zenz. So his research is widely cited in your report, and his research is something that many reporters have based a lot of their reporting on, looking at what's happening in Xinjiang. And a website called The Gray Zone wrote a defamatory piece about him, looking to discredit him. And I will also mention that The Gray Zone also wrote a similarly defamatory piece about Elise Anderson. If you look at The Gray Zone, at who retweets it, at who works there, at who they engage with on social media, they frequently tweet and retweet articles from Russia Today and other, Russian state-affiliated media outlets, Chinese state media outlets, and several people who work at the Gray Zone, including Ajit Singh and Max Blumenthal, are regularly quoted in Chinese state media outlets in the Global Times or interviewed on CGTN. I think Max Blumenthal is even, there has been at the United Nations headquarters in Geneva, the Chinese mission there has set up an exhibit with an interview with Max Blumenthal about Adrian Zenz on loop, on the grounds of the United Nations, trying to discredit this. And it's, that's a strategy where you use, sort of a back-ended means to create an entire ecosystem that looks to discredit the people who have been so instrumental in bringing some of these issues to light. So those were just sort of the main parts that I wanted to highlight, and I look forward to hearing what the rest of the panelists have to say.
Thank you very much. That was a very good overview. Turning now to Sarah Cook, if you could share your perspective.
Thanks, and I will just echo what Bethany said about the report. It's very thorough and thoughtful, and I think to Bethany's point about, I think tying the threads together, even the slide that you just showed a moment ago, in terms of showing kind of the evolution of the narratives and how they have manifested and evolved over time, is I think really important to understanding both what's been going on and what we might anticipate. My other points actually surprisingly do not overlap with Bethany, which was one of my one of the concerns I had as I was thinking about this. And I think there are a few things that really stood out to me, and I think in terms of thinking about the broader context of what China is doing in the internet and the CCP are doing in the international space. So I think one is just what we've seen overall in the past decade, but especially since 2017. Is a much more aggressive approach on the part of the party and state media, and a more aggressive tone, particularly with regards to those who it sees as being defamatory or critical in some way. And so I think if you look for example, and I think one piece of that puzzle has been the way in which the content that we see, for example, coming out of Chinese state media on social media, for example, like Facebook or YouTube or Twitter. But I think other examples we've seen relate to the Hong Kong protesters, relate to other particular individuals, critics of the Chinese government, democracy activists like Yang Jianli, people jailed in China like Wei Minhai. When you look at the kind of the bot networks and the disinformation that has become more present coming from China on global social media networks, a lot of the content relates to that type of content of smearing and trying to discredit particular individuals. But certainly a subset of that is on Xinjiang is this combination of the kind of whitewashing and then this much harsher narrative. So it's like this kind of positive, oh, Uyghurs are actually happy. I thought the title of the report was very very good and very apt in terms of how there's an attempt to portray Uyghurs. And that's long running as a narrative in Chinese state media, but I think it becomes even more Orwellian when you know that this is happening at a time when so many people have lost their freedom, families have been separated, people are in really horrific conditions. I think the flip side is this counterterrorism narrative and this effort to really frame Uyghurs, who we know from the individual cases, and Reihan can speak more about this, of who some of the people who have been taken away are, that they are very far from what would be considered violent extremists. But that's how the Chinese government frames it. And CGTN did this huge, quote, documentary on terrorism in Xinjiang and has been using all kinds of ways to promote it. So I think that's one of the things that we see in terms of just the broader aggressiveness and this negative tone. Because previously, I think you see a lot of the following, for example, the Chinese state media have on platforms like Facebook was generated by, I would say, kind of fluff. It's pandas, it's bullet trains, it's Belt and Road Initiative, things that kind of obviously promoting the goals of the state, but I would say in a much less problematic, perhaps, way. It whitewashes and it avoids the negative, but it doesn't actively attack people who are being persecuted in China. So I think that's one of the things that I would say. I think the other relates to the actual tactics that we see being used. So I think one of the things, and Bethany touched on this with regards to the kind of work that the United Front Work Department does, but one of the things that's really striking in the report is the details in which it really lays out the various ways in which the Chinese government and party apparatus have tried to make use of international actors to repeat the talking points and to speak and support the party. And I think one of the things that's really important when we think about Chinese disinformation and media influence generally is that it's really global. There's really no market that is too small and no country that is too small. And part of this is because of an eye on the UN votes and things like that. But part of it is just in general the way in which the CCP really wants to shape the narratives, especially in the global south. And so if you actually look at some of the ads to gain followers on Facebook and the like, a lot of them are targeted at countries in Africa and Latin America and in South and Southeast and Central Asia. I think one of the things that the report does well is that I think you trace some of the Facebook ads specifically promoting content related to Xinjiang, and those are some of the same countries that you see there. But I think one of the other aspects is these tours for foreign diplomats and for foreign journalists. And one of the things that was striking for me was the full list of countries of, especially, I think it was the diplomats. Well, first of all, Chinese officials have said there have been something like 1,000 people that have come on these from different countries around the world. You guys found about 40 countries that you listed. And, you know, I think it's quite the range. There's clearly an emphasis on Muslim majority countries, countries from the Middle East, countries from South and Southeast Asia and Central Asia. But there are also, you know, I think it's not only authoritarian regimes. You have kind of more hybrid or semi-democratic, you know, places like Malaysia, you have Nigeria, you have stronger democracies like India and Indonesia that are having officials that are going on these trips. So I think that's one thing that's I think useful to really keep in mind. It was striking to see the full list of countries. And similarly, I think when it comes to some of the media and the journalists and the outlets that have been taken, and I think one of the things, you know, as you describe some of the tours to the camps and this refitting of the camps, it does fit with, you know, interviews that I've done with people from other communities like Falun Gong practitioners who had been at like Masanjiao, which is really notorious labor camp that's now closed. And when there was a tour that came, it was exactly the same thing. People who say hadn't renounced their faith were moved out of the way. The tour attendees were given access, and even the people present at the camp were given access to parts of the camp that they normally would not visit. That's not normally where they were held. And that's exactly what you described, where I think a lot of us have seen some of the footage of people at the centers playing basketball. And you described very clearly that people who have left the camps have said that that's not a part of first of all, there aren't usually basketball courts there. And second of all, that's not a part of the camp that they would normally have access to. So I think this kind of Potemkin village type tour is something that we've seen in the past. But I think one of the things that's new is the breadth of the number of countries and the efforts to really promote this and the reach because of the social media access. And then I think the last thing I would note, which stood out to me, is the mixed impact that it has. I mean, certainly it seems like in terms of international media, you know, major Western media, you know, reports and projects, like the one Bethany worked on coming from the journalist, research by UHRP or Adrian Zenz is, I think, having much more of an impact than whatever the Global Times is saying. I think in other countries it becomes split, and I think you see a combination of some of the journalists from different countries who have gone on these tours coming out and being quoted in Chinese state media or even in their own local media as saying like, yeah, you know, they seem the conditions seemed okay. These were not concentration camps and the like. I think what's even more interesting is the pushback from some who have attended, where you see a Jordanian journalist coming out and saying, you know, the mosques are all closed. People aren't able to pray. There's security checkpoints everywhere. An Albanian lecturer saying that, you know, the whole experience was clearly very repressive and controlled. And I think that's where then some of those individuals then again face their own backlash from outlets like the Global Times. But I think it is really interesting to see those situations where, again, in some of these particularly important countries, I think for the CCP in terms of the Muslim countries, and trying to suppress criticism, that some of these types of activities have actually backfired. And I think that's, you know, an upshot of some of these. So So I think that's what I'd say. I think overall it's part of a broader trend, but there are definitely certain narratives that are unique to Xinjiang and certain aspects of this that are new in terms of the use of social media, the use of Twitter bots and things like that to manipulate and amplify disinformation, and the sheer global reach of these activities.
Thank you very much. That was a really good overview. May I turn now to Reihan to get your thoughts?
Yeah, I absolutely echo both Bethany and Sarah. I think it's an incredibly comprehensive report. So as I'm reading this, I think this disinformation campaign actually goes back to as far as 2014, but I think we just didn't know what to call it. And I think even at that time, the government already waged a war to true narrative and started its disinformation. In 2014, I believe the Chinese government started the Strike Hard campaign, and I think, I remember I received a very nice email from a friend, a Chinese friend, because I studied during my undergrad in China, and he sent me this article which talks about the Xinjiang problem is as a result of poverty and how the local people in Xinjiang fails to catch up the trends and the modern society of China. And I remember I was insulted because I'm like, I'm from Urumqi, have you been to Xinjiang? Have you seen what's modernity look like? But I responded to his message again, because I really value our friendship. He said, dear friend, I said, 新疆问题特别复杂, which means Xinjiang problem is complicated. So I also fall into the government's narrative. They always kept saying Xinjiang problem is complicated. So I think this statement itself, it was designed intentional because it consolidates the party's control that only party can handle Xinjiang's problem because it's so complicated. So the citizens should be rest assured that the government is taking care of it's the most problematic region. Now, so, and I think now, the past few years, I think this level of very sophisticated disinformation campaign is in part is as a result of digital authoritarianism that we're seeing, not just in China, but everywhere. And we all know that right now, China has a very elevated role at the international stage. It's the world's second most powerful country economically, and it's also very powerful militarily. So I think the Chinese government is much more assertive. So it's so many factors are all combination of the Chinese government's messaging. And the camps are not, we all know that it's not simply designed for re-education. It's a term that the Chinese government managed to inject into our public discourse. But the way, as an attorney, I always love analyzing words. And I think, in part, they specifically use this term because it has a historical resonance. It happened in the 70s, so it's nothing new. It's not a concentration camps. It's not. They're not actually singling out ethnic minority. Han Chinese people had also kind of gone through this. But it's absolutely contrary to the highest level of governments repeatedly offered statements like break their lineage, rounding up everyone who should be rounded up, right? So I think we all know, those who are China watchers or informed citizens know that re-education is nothing but a euphemism for physical and mental destruction of the Uyghur people. But I feel like a lot of shifts from being on the defense of outright denial and trying to defend what it's doing to the Uyghur people to now to pivoting to offense. So if we look at the Global Times and GNTV, all this media platform, what they're doing is every day, almost, especially in the past few weeks, I've been seeing you know, these girls are dancing and life couldn't be happier or more beautiful in Xinjiang. And I always get insulted because I can understand that you want to try to shape a different narrative, but I don't know if I should be more insulted about the execution of the lies, that it's always somebody dancing. And I think that's also the kind of message that the Chinese government intend to send. Like, these people are just like, you know, love singing and dancing. And it really aligns with some of the statements that it rolled out. Like, you know, the Uyghur people are very simple-minded, like uneducated, like, you know, they just love singing and dancing. So it's quite complex, and it shows like a level of sophistication that we have not seen so far. And another point that I thought is that, you know, like, we're talking about a country that the citizens cannot even like use like Twitter, but almost every Chinese official who have some sort of like a foreign officer position do have like Twitter. And that's what I mean by like they're really pivoting to offense, and even like being able to inject itself to some of the political discourse that we have in the United States, like, you know, the Black Lives Matter, and trying to like deflect. And then we come to 2 weeks ago in the UK, when the ambassador Liu Xiaoming was asked by the British journalist on BBC about what's happening in the footage where men were shaved, shackled, and blindfolded to let onto these trains. And, you know, there was a bit of stammering, there was a deflecting and a rephrasing, but he said, "Have you been to Xinjiang? That is the most beautiful place." Again, it's like a happy, beautiful, like these terms, they constantly kept injecting. And I think, like, you know, I always feel like, you know, all these campaigns are like, in some ways designed so well and correlated to show like a new level of sophistication that we as international community are not able to put together. And I could be wrong, and overestimating their power. And another key point I do want to mention in this report, which was pretty critical, is silencing critics and suppressing damaging information are central parts of the disinformation campaign. I've noticed, and perhaps because I'm somebody who's campaigning for my brother, I normally don't do it, and unless like I'm really upset in a day, I get up and I see something really like provoking from the Chinese officials. But I know a lot of Uyghurs, like whenever Chinese officials start to tweet something, they all like, you know, start to comment that they're missing family members. Like, I normally don't do it, but the minute I did it to the spokesperson, it took, I'm assuming somebody handles her Twitter, but took less than 5 minutes to block me. And I was impressed in some ways that, you know, like, because, and that's what they're doing, because so they collect people who only endorse their opinion and can share their narrative and redesigning, you know, what China is, or how we should look at China as a country that respects the rule of law, democracy. It's quite international. Look at all these officials, like, you know, they can engage in political discourse here at home or here in the United States. So, in terms of the, I think, you know, some of you like really talked about the UN, and I just want to emphasize one critical point. And I think, yes, like in many ways, you know, informed citizens or like readers who know what's actually happening don't take these disinformation campaigns seriously. But the saddest reality is like a certain, like, or a small group of people are actually buying into this. So this disinformation campaign actually is having some of the desired effect that they intended in the first place. So so I think overall, so we're looking at a country that starts from outright denial to rewriting and redesigning its narrative to pivoting to offense right now. And all of this comes from its emboldened status at the international stage, and also a combination of like digital authoritarianism.
Thank you very much. Turning now to Tang Bia.
Thank you to UHRP and Nicole for the wonderful report and this organizing this panel. What's happening in Xinjiang is really the worst humanitarian disaster in 21st century. But the Chinese authorities try to deny, banalize, and justify the concentration camps. Chinese Communist Party has a long tradition to twist the history and reality, brainwashing its people, and now it's increasingly and aggressively exported disinformation and propaganda on the international stage. I have a personal experience when I was kidnapped by Chinese secret police in 2011. People from human rights organizations asked Chinese delegates about my case, and their response was that Teng Biao was never arrested or detained, and he was visiting Harvard Law School like that. Obviously, it's a lie. And one Chinese government was asked about the cases like Gao Zhisheng, Panchen Lama, or any other jailed or disappeared people. They never told the truth. They said they don't know. They denied the whole thing, or they said something like China is a country with rule of law. Like a China's spokesperson Hua Chunying said the reports about Xinjiang's concentration camps are pure fabrication. So it's widely misunderstood that the CGTN, CCTV, the China Daily, the Xinhua News Agency are media. So they look like media, but they are not. They are totally controlled by the Chinese government, and they are part of the propaganda machine. So it's necessary, it's correct to require them to register as foreign agents according to FARA, the Foreign Agent Registration Act. So recently, like Safeguard Defenders and Peter Humphrey and others are suing CGT and CCTV because of their involvement of forced confession and the twisting and the best reports. According to Hoover Institution report in late 2018, most of the Chinese language media in the United States have been controlled by the Chinese government. It's more so in other countries. The organs in charge of the disinformation and propaganda work, including like United Front, the Central Propaganda Department, the State Council's Information Office, but there are many other organizations involving in this the disinformation campaign, like the All China Federation of Overseas Chinese and Confucius Institute, CSSA, the Chinese Students and Scholars Association, China's Chamber of Commerce, Townsmen Association, etc. So most non-governmental organizations in Chinese diaspora communities are like supporters of the propaganda and disinformation campaign. And China has eliminated almost every independent Chinese language media in the United States, and it established its own news outlets and social media. And Chinese government strictly censors the contents of WeChat and Douyin, the TikTok, For various reasons, many Chinese people, old and young, rely on these Chinese language newspaper and social media. They don't read English, or their English is not good enough, or they simply feel safe or satisfied when reading the stuff provided by the Chinese Communist Party or pro-Beijing tabloids. And numerous verified WeChat accounts, which own tens of millions readers, play a very active role in spreading rumors and disinformation. CCP is very skilled of manipulating narratives. They are keen to peddle the ideas and the discourse of something like the win-win cooperation, like building a new model of the shared future of human beings. Like a human rights with Chinese characteristics, the China model or Asian value, like human rights should not be politicized. So CCP used this kind of discourse to undermine and refuse criticism. It's extremely absurd that on the one hand, they detain millions of Uyghurs and other ethnic minority into concentration camps, and at the same time seeing the shared future of all human beings. And also like the right to development. So Chinese government prioritize the right to development. Actually, they use this to refuse or dilute the basic political human rights. And another point is international scholars' self-censorship also make a favorable environment for Chinese disinformation campaign. So CCP propaganda and disinformation are generally effective in China and beyond its borders. As Mao Zedong famously said, if we don't occupy the cultural and ideological battlefield, the enemies will. It's true. So we should not let the evil regime take advantage of our freedom and erode our society. And we should confront, resist, and sanction their propaganda machine, as we have to disclose, oppose the human rights violations, and bring the people who committed crimes against humanity to justice.
Yeah, Thank you very much to all our panelists. Now we're going to take a few questions from the audience. I'd like to start with one from Professor Magnus Vigesco from Cornell University. I recommend our viewers take a look at his extensive bibliography on the Uyghur Crisis, which is hosted on the UHRP website. You can find it on the landing page. He has a question for Sarah. You emphasize the range of countries that signed up to support China, which is true, but sometimes very few officials in these countries are actually involved. China Media Project did an investigation of countries supporting China on Hong Kong and found that the lead country, Cuba, never even told its own public about its role. Wouldn't it be similar with Belarus and other countries supporting China on Xinjiang? How can we emphasize that it isn't these countries, but a captured government in these countries?
So I actually, I think Bethany might be better placed. I have it in terms of looking at who it was in the UN and also talking maybe a little bit about kind of how the United Work Front Department really works to do that type of elite capture. But yes, actually I've seen a number of those kinds of instances. And I think even in some of the countries I mentioned, where on the one hand, you might have an official or a journalist go on one of these tours and come back or be quoted as saying something seemingly supporting the campaign, you might have somebody from the same country then coming out and sharing a very different perspective. I think especially in countries where there's a more open environment. I mean, I think one of the things we see generally is that in countries where they're just on their own, they're more authoritarian and there's tighter control that their own leaders have over the media environment there, that when those same officials and governments end up with, have a very cultivated, the CCP and the Chinese government have cultivated a very close relationship with them, then that relationship basically almost automatically translates into the Chinese government narratives, and in some cases the state media content itself flowing into the state media of those same governments. I think it becomes a lot more complicated when you look at more diverse media spaces, and that's where you see maybe both sides. But I think that's also where the Chinese government and Communist Party seems to be putting, I think, more resources to also reach people directly. So, well, one, to work through certain outlets. So, for example, having the ambassador to Indonesia publish an op-ed in the Jakarta Post, for example. But I think some of the social media ads we see trying to reach people on Facebook in a variety of different countries, that I think there is a sense that, in some of these places, that the public does have a role to play in influencing government decisions, whether it's to sign on to something like that or not at the UN, or maybe just generally what the government's position or what China's reputation is in those countries. And I think the Chinese government is really trying to affect that. I mean, one of the things you see, for example, and it's hard to know exactly what the circumstances are surrounding this, but if you look at the Pew surveys from like 2018 or 2019, some of the countries where China generally previously had, and maybe still does have, there's a pretty favorable public view, but that are countries that have kind of significant communities of Muslims, and also where you've seen media reporting about what's happening in Xinjiang. Between 2018 and 2019, the views of China dropped quite a bit, by 7 or 8 percentage points in places like Indonesia. I think Tunisia was another one that I had seen. So I think that even just seeing some of those types of numbers perhaps galvanizes parts of the Chinese propaganda apparatus to be even more aggressive. And also, I think, to use, not just these types of ads, but also various kinds of disinformation. We haven't gotten to that, and I don't know if there have been cases like this so much. I think there was a little bit in the report, but I think some of the other examples we've seen more related to COVID is the use of Twitter bots in places like Italy or in Serbia, basically seeming to amplify local voices in the local language that are saying, like, thank you, China, for sending COVID relief, or thank you. Yeah, so basically that was in Serbia, or the EU never sent anything. Things that actually in some cases don't reflect the actual views of many people in that country. But this kind of makes some of those types of hashtags trend. So I don't know if we've necessarily seen that yet. But one of the things with regards to the general efforts, especially on Twitter, if you look at the hashtags that some of these officials of the media use, is to try to get content on topics, searches for words like Xinjiang to trend. And I think I actually did very recently do some searches, and for Uyghur, I think it was on YouTube perhaps, it's quite diverse, and you look at that content and you actually see that there's a lot about what's happening and personal experiences of Uyghurs and the forced labor and all of the types of reporting that we've all seen about the crisis. If you search for Xinjiang, perhaps because that's actually the name for the region that Chinese state media tend to use more, you see actually a much heavier representation of Chinese state media. So I think that's actually one of the things strategically they're trying to do, to reach people in different countries or who might be looking for information. But I don't know if Bethany has more to say perhaps on kind of how the political influence aspects of the United Front Works Department's work translates into the media space as well.
Yeah, I can address that. And thank you for that careful outline, Sarah, and for your earlier remarks, which I thought were really excellent and pulled out some excellent threads from the report. So I'll give sort of two examples, and I think the question is a very apt one. And if we look at, for example, the most recent set of warning letters to the United Nations over Hong Kong, my colleague at Axios, Dave Lawler, did an analysis of the 53 countries that expressed their support for China's policies in Hong Kong for its national security law. Those countries were disproportionately non-democratic. And the countries that signed the letter opposing the national security law in Hong Kong were all democratic. We're all, I think they were all democracies or somewhat flawed democracies. And so if you look at these overwhelmingly non-democracies, and you do another look at them by their ties to the Belt and Road, almost all of them were either explicitly part of the Belt and Road or were cooperating with China informally. And the Belt and Road is very heavily, it involves a lot of money, a lot of loans, a lot of deals. It's an excellent mechanism for elite capture, and that's another concept that Sarah mentioned, capturing governments. So there's this kind of nexus between China and authoritarian governments because it is so easy for them to use corruption to establish influence over those governments. Now, with this in mind, let's look at Muslim governments that govern Muslim majority nations. I'm not going to say Muslim governments, so governments that govern Muslim majority nations. Now, it is certainly true that these governments have overwhelmingly been silent about what is happening in Xinjiang. However, the most important thing is to not view them as their populaces as being Muslim or not Muslim. So the question, why aren't Muslims saying anything about this? This is not a helpful question. The question is, are the governments themselves democratic in some way or not? Or where do they fall on the spectrum of authoritarian? So if you look at Turkey, for example, if you look at Indonesia, governments that represent Muslim majority populations but have some degree of freedom of speech, have some degree of elections and representational government. Those are the countries, and Malaysia as well, not perfect, but some degree of that. Those are the nations where you have had actual demonstrations on the ground by people in support of Chinese Muslims and non-Muslim Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And where I want to sort of tie this all into the discussion of disinformation is that China's disinformation and propaganda aimed at foreign countries, one of its most important functions is to give cover to those governments to express a legitimate reason or a reasoning behind them not saying anything. So it gives cover to Iran. It gives cover to Saudi Arabia to say, oh no, look, we sent people, we took a look. Oh, this is just the West being the West. They're just lying, and actually everything is fine. But even in these most repressive governments, so I'll give you two examples: Bahrain and Qatar. I think it was Qatar. I don't think it was. I think it was Qatar. I'm sorry, I don't remember quite the specifics. You can look and see. In one of these countries, they have a representative assembly that has no power. It's sort of a figurehead. I think it was Qatar. And some number of representatives in this non-powerful assembly actually came out and made a statement condemning the camps. This was, I believe, last January. That statement was reported, and then it disappeared. I don't even have to tell you, it happened behind the scenes. The people in charge of relations with China nixed that, right? And then in the other countries, so Bahrain, there was some representative in the government who individually made a statement. Same thing, that was kind of quashed. So whenever you see people acting on their own instincts and acting on their own sensibilities as Muslims, as people, as people with values, they try to speak up. And again, so the point of this disinformation is to change the narrative, to give cover to other authoritarian governments.
Thank you. I'd like to remind the audience that you're welcome to submit questions. We are taking questions from the audience right now in your questions box. Right now, I have a question for Tang Biao from a Uyghur listener, Karahan Ozturk. You suggest resisting Chinese propaganda. What's the most efficient way to fight this as an ordinary citizen?
Okay, thank you for the question. So as a ordinary citizen, what we can do, most importantly, to disclose the truth, to help spreading the truth, what's happening in Xinjiang, East Turkestan, and so many people don't know, especially like the Chinese people, even the Chinese people living in Western countries, they enjoy free speech, but they they don't know very much about the concentration camps, and so that's we can do on our social media, Twitter, Facebook, our like if you have WeChat or TikTok, and we can tell the truth, and another thing is to as I said, to oppose the Chinese, the so-called Chinese media, CCTV, CGTN, Global Times, News, Xinhua News Agency. So we can lobby if there is not such a law to resist, to require them to register as foreign agent. We can lobby our government to pass this kind of law, and we should tell tell other people that these tabloid are not media. They are part of the disinformation and propaganda machine. Yeah.
Thank you. I also have a question from Sophie Lee, and I think this one would be appropriate for Reihan, since she has spoken already about talking to her Chinese friends. The question is, how would you recommend speaking about the issue to Chinese relatives, some of whom, even if highly educated, don't believe reporting on the Uyghur region or are trying to justify it?
You know, I recently published an op-ed in the Harvard Crimson, why the Chinese Harvard community must speak out against the Chinese government's atrocities. And some thought that was actually ridiculous, that, like I'm even suggesting that, because everybody who even dares to speak out could be punished. But I did so. And then I received this really beautiful message in combination of reflecting on my speech back at Harvard in March 9th. So I think, the thing is, people want to believe what they want to believe. And sometimes you can try that hard and they still buy the narratives that they want to believe, and there's nothing you could do. But if there's a chance, you could still impact a certain percentage of people and engage. I'm a big believer in engagement. I'm so glad that I wrote 2 op-eds in the Harvard Crimson, laying out why the Harvard Chinese community should, in a concerted effort, do something about what's happening in Xinjiang. And I recently even wrote an op-ed officially called it a genocide. And I think a lot of people don't understand how dire the circumstances are. Like in one of my recent events that I was speaking at the invitation of Amnesty International, a Chinese student attended this event. And she said, for security reason, I don't want to show my face, but I do want to say that I'm very sorry for what my government doing to your people. So it gives me hope that as long as that we engage and speak the truth, I think, at the end of the day, Chinese people in my personal view, should feel most compassionate to what's happening to the Uyghur community. Because at the end of the day, we all live in China. And there is a bit of like, connections, like there's even my family, like, we have like a long, beautiful relationships with our like Han Chinese neighbors. And those relationships remain intact despite the Chinese government kidnapped and detained and even imprisoned my brother. Because those are the core of like a human spirit and love that the Chinese government cannot break. So I still believe in just engaging and trying to show them, even like share the real human stories. Like my story really touched people. And this Harvard student told me that, so I started my speech with referring to the projector that shows the topic of the event, which says, the surveilled, the detained, and disappeared. So I read it for the word effect, and I said, these are my people. And I don't know why, I just couldn't hold myself together, and I cried. And for 2 minutes, it wasn't like, so I just cried. And then, this student said, when you cried, I cried too. And I truly believe that, because he felt my pain. So I still like, believe that, engaging, because that is the one community can truly change the Chinese government's brutal and despicable genocide that we were speaking at the moment.
Thank you very much for that. I have a question for Bethany. A few days ago, the Chinese and Russian foreign ministries had some consultations about disinformation. The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs said, countries should strengthen solidarity and coordination, jointly reject disinformation so that political viruses, such as rumors and slanders, and the perpetrators and manipulators behind the scene will have no place to hide. You've spoken before about the differences between typical Chinese and Russian disinformation strategies. I wanted to get your thoughts on that, and if you see potential for more coordination and collaboration between the two.
Sure. So I'm going to cite a very useful tool that the German Marshall Fund launched a few months ago. It's the Hamilton 2.0 dashboard, I believe it's called. And it's a really great tool. I advise anyone who's interested to check it out. It's interactive. You can go and make searches and queries. And what it does is it tracks Chinese and Russian disinformation on social media. And one of the things that in one of their initial reports upon the launch of the tool, of the dashboard, was they looked at the interplay between known Chinese state-affiliated Twitter accounts and known Russian state-affiliated Twitter accounts, and saw that they were retweeting each other and quoting each other and citing each other with a really high degree of frequency. Now, just from these data points, it's hard, you can't know if that's an official policy or if it's just that they happen to, be like, oh, hey, gosh, I just happen to agree with RT, and it casting the US as hypocritical all the time. So I'm just like hitting the retweet button, But I think this summit that we just have seen between the Chinese and the Russians is an indicator that this is in fact a policy, that this is in fact a strategy. And we're seeing a sort of a convergence, most definitely from the Chinese side. They appear to be learning from the Russians. So for example, 2016, the Russian state interference in US elections using social media. For several years, the known wisdom was China doesn't do that. China doesn't do that kind of backhand, behind the scenes manipulation aimed at other people's societies on topics not related to China. Traditionally, China's propaganda, and indeed what we've been talking about mostly in this panel, is stuff about China itself, wanting to present what it does in a better light. But we have, especially since the coronavirus, but really since the Hong Kong protests last year, we have seen Chinese state-affiliated actors doing things that resemble what Russia did in 2016 in the US and did before that in Europe, and continues to do up to the present in many countries around the world. So we're definitely seeing a concerted effort on the part of the Chinese government to learn from Russia's disinformation. And so I think it really does point to, we don't want to overstate the degree of shared interests and the lack of conflict between Russia and China, because they have a very complicated relationship. But it does seem to me that they are identifying an area that they have a lot in common, and a common perceived enemy, which is the United States and Western countries. And especially since the coronavirus and since the rise of these wolf warrior diplomats on Twitter, these Chinese diplomats who were really aggressive, as Reihan was mentioning, this level of aggression, that really, it seems to be sort of a new page in the Chinese government's book, this boldness, this willingness to just, lie right in your face. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you very much for that. We have a question from Nathan Koka, a journalist. He was asking about, besides BRI investment, what are the other methods or tools the Chinese government uses to keep Muslim majority nations silent about the Uyghurs, and why it's been effective? We've already touched a bit on that. We have a related question from a Uyghur in exile, Kayum Asimov, who's asking, what would be the best approach in reaching out to Muslim states to confront the CCP on Uyghur genocide? So basically, is there anything that can be done to counter these narratives in Muslim majority countries?
I'm happy to share some thoughts on that. So I think, first, I want to acknowledge by saying that the countries that condemn China represent 2/3 of the world economy, right? So the other countries, some of which are actually, they sit in the UN Human Rights Council, which in itself is quite an insult to the UN Human Rights Council. So what is happening there? And I think in part, I really hope the US didn't retreat from the UN Human Rights Council. It is true that there are many dictators over there, but I think it also legitimized the Chinese government's maneuvering and engaging with these Muslim countries to win this votes. So I think when these authoritarian governments may be able to buy these corrupt governments, they can never buy the hearts and minds of people. And we've seen that in the case of Masoud Özil. When he condemned the Chinese government, there was a massive protest in Turkey. And at the same time, the same phenomenon happened in Indonesia, right? So I think we need to find a way to inform the citizens of those countries, despite the amount of effort their own government tried to sell the Chinese government's narrative. And in doing so, I think we're sort of bypassing and sending the direct message to the citizens and let them know what's happening. And these countries, they also have social media. Some don't, or they do have in a limited way to have access to true information. And the government also controls information, just like the Chinese government does. But there would be certain voices like Masoud Özil who could be incredibly powerful, and then it would have a ripple effect, and we would see a massive protest. So ultimately, I think we need to engage with citizens, because I'm not a big believer in dealing with undemocratic countries and just sort of hoping that one day they might change their position, because they're economically so dependent on China. It's not just because of a Belt and Road project. It's just, in part, they also want to try to to make sure their economy survive, like even the pandemic, or even like survive and make sure their citizens are happy with these like authoritarian government. And that is the case especially in Turkey, because Turkish economy is doing absolutely not doing well. And for the Turkish government, first and foremost problem to stay still in power is to make sure the economy still like survive and even like thrive. So what would happen is like that's why like they're closing up to China. And I think in one way this could be a very unpopular opinion and something that I'm hoping that this message would come across. I think we did push Turkey a bit to the other side. I think NATO for years, like and even especially the European Union, like made sure like Turkey would never be considered like a democratic country, when in many ways, like especially in the past 10 years, they reformed their laws. They don't even have death penalty like many other countries. Like they even became part of the European Code of Human Rights. And I think the Turkish government kind of saw like, no matter how I try, perhaps like I'm never good enough. So then the other is like going to the other extreme. So I mean, it could be a very unpopular opinion, but I just want to throw it out there, and that's why I feel like I think there has to be alliance to make sure, like, you know, we pull Turkey back in, and to make sure that Turkish government and Turkey in itself goes on the right path of being on the right history, and also like a democracy.
Thank you very much for that. I actually have a quick question for Sarah Cook. Tung Biao was talking a bit earlier about kind of countering Chinese state media in the West. Recently, the group Safeguard Defenders was submitting complaints to the UK's broadcasting oversight group, the Ofcom, and they were successful in their complaint about the broadcast of Peter Humphrey's forced confession. They're doing a similar thing for the broadcast of a documentary about Uyghurs in East Turkestan, and they are also trying to get their license revoked as a TV network that is owned or controlled by a political party, which is against UK laws. Do you support this kind of tactic, and do you think it's effective? Some people question whether China, even to what degree they value being able to freely broadcast in the West as compared to the value they get from being able to block journalists from entering and reporting on China and freely broadcasting to Chinese citizens.
Well, I don't know that the two are mutually exclusive. I think that both are important to them. I think the main thing that, you know, I think what's useful to keep in mind, and I think what is really interesting with regards to the approach that Safeguard Defenders has taken and the response from Ofcom, is that, you know, in the West or in other democracies, there are broadcasting regulations. It's a rule of law country. There are rules as to what, you know, how certain types of content may be aired, what are the basis for having a license, and if you violate those rules, then there are certain penalties that should be put in place. And I think one of the things we see happening is that, you know, in some ways, Chinese state media have gotten around those rules in a lot of places, and around some of those regulations, have slipped under the radar. Maybe it's a matter of political will, maybe it's a matter that regulators, it's a new space, regulators aren't aware, and so they need NGOs and others to point this out to them. But I think looking at, you know, specific instances of where Chinese state media or other media affiliated with China have violated the rules, on paper at least, of the country where they're broadcasting in, bringing that to the attention of regulators to then do an investigation, make an assessment based on what is normally the practice in that democratic country, is basically just using a democratic process, and I think is actually really important. It's a really important way of dealing with this type of influence and this type of content, and in a way that isn't just about more authority, you know, censorship and blocking. So we're not kind of going to lowest common denominator, but we're trying to figure out what is the right way to navigate and to point out where there is problematic, particularly problematic content. So I think even if you just look at the US, whether it's some of the foreign mission registrations, FAR registrations, I mean, to be honest, like there is still quite a lot of, you know, as Tang Biao was saying, a Chinese language media in the United States that I think arguably could be and properly should be registered under FARA, but they're not. And I think it partly has to do with perhaps the capacity at DOJ, the Chinese language skills. And I think that's one of the things where some of us who maybe are more familiar can try to think of how to influence that decision making, which is basically what Safeguard Defenders has done. And I think if you look, you know, it can have a real impact. I mean, Taiwan is another really interesting example where there are various mergers and purchases that were attempted by companies with very clear pro-Beijing stance, but also that own multiple media outlets. And so talking about it from this perspective of kind of cross ownership, and is it appropriate for a company or an individual that owns a bunch of media outlets to also say own cable company that decides what media outlets can get on cable, is obviously a conflict of interest. And so you saw both protests, but also decisions by the media regulator there to put certain conditions and things like that. And again, I think that's actually a very thoughtful and democratic way of approaching the complexities of how Chinese state media try to really reach users and manipulate content and air very, very problematic content that incites hatred even against communities like Uyghurs or others who are persecuted by the CCP. So I actually do think it's quite a fruitful and interesting, and I think the fact that Ofcom has gone through its regular procedures, and I think in some cases has agreed, and in some cases had said maybe there isn't really a problem here, again, kind of shows you know, the fundamentally rule of law basis here, because, and I'm trying to gauge how to evaluate certain content based on existing precedents in democratic countries.
Thank you very much for that. I have a question from Nur Iman, a journalist with the Radio Free Asia Uyghur Service, asking about the statement that UHRP released yesterday. UHRP remembers the 2014 mass killing of Uyghurs in Ilizhu, East Turkestan. He's asking, this kind of mass killing is related to disinformation or not. We've always, at UHRP, have always made it our mission to counter secrecy, denial, whitewashing of human rights crimes against the Uyghurs. This incident in 2014 is just one of many such mass killings and atrocities that have been covered up over the decades. So this week we're paying tribute to the victims of those killings exactly 6 years ago today. I'd like to ask our panelists if they have any thoughts about kind of previous cover-ups that have been going on, particularly in East Turkestan, and thoughts about how it's been turned into a basically a vacuum of information vacuum into which propaganda can easily be filled. Reihan, do you have any thoughts? This particularly affects, I think, Uyghurs living overseas who, you know, have been out of touch from their families for so long. Do you have any thoughts about how difficult it is to get information out of the region?
Yeah, I think one incident I recall was, this was, I believe, also like 2014 when there was about like 300 Uyghur refugees ended up in the refugee camps in Thailand. So, but they claim that they're Turkish. They refuse to acknowledge that they are Chinese citizens. So Turkish government sent a delegation, and this was a time like, you know, they were really taking ownership of Uyghurs and respecting the fact that they are part of the Turkic community. So the first thing they did is like they brought like a first batch of women and children as the first top priority to Turkey, and they were about like 150. But the other half just left in Thailand. So, but then they came to Turkey, but they couldn't enter, and they had to like go through this like documentation process for about 2 weeks, and a lot of Turks and protesters. Finally, they entered. But then after, so I always wonder what happened to the rest of the people in this refugee camps in Thailand that were arrested. And eventually the Thai authorities handed them over to the Chinese government. And the Chinese state media portrayed this image of Uyghur men, you know, like they put they covered them like, you know, these like how do we call it, like a,
yeah, like a black bag, basically.
Yeah, it's black bag, right? Yeah, and I'm trying to like remember that picture. It used to be very vivid in my memory, but I think maybe like I also try not to remember, because then I feel like, you know, what happened to those men. And you know, for any country, whenever somebody tried to seek refugee status, like under the law, they have obligation to hear their case and make sure, like, you know, that we review and examine on the basis of their merits of the case. But the Thai authorities, again, at the Chinese governments, you know, because they have so much power over the Thailand, and end up sending them back. And I think those incidents and the way the Chinese media portrayed these men, and I think years later I kept seeing like some of the video footage of the terrorism in Xinjiang, and they portrayed this image, and it's very disheartening, because, you know, I mean, they're no different than anybody who's seeking like refugees or asylum status at the US border. But it's just like the way the Chinese government portrayed them in the media, and it's despicable. It's absolutely unacceptable. And again, the same goes to the Thai authorities for handing them over. Yeah, so I think those sort of things always, you know, you remember those things, but I think, you know, at that time, many of us were silent until like it really ended up impacting each one of us to the point. And that's why it's, you know, you always need to speak out. But yeah, those memories, you know, I think it has the, you know, deep impact on you as an individual, especially for me as an attorney, and, you know, you can never forget.
Thank you. I have a related question for Bethany. I'd like to hear your thoughts about what you think the current state of journalism inside China is. Is it becoming increasingly challenging to report, particularly on what's happening with the Uyghurs, although a lot of really great journalism has been done on the subject? And what do you think the prospects are in the future?
I have been, I would say, astonished by the fact that, you know, major foreign media outlets have continued to report, you know, do very serious investigative reports on what's happening with Uyghurs, on the genocide, and the Chinese government hasn't just kicked everybody out. I continue to be amazed by that. Now, if you look at actual access to Xinjiang for foreign journalists, it's very, very difficult. I mean, there's so many things that we have to rely on alternate means to learn about, or just we don't know at all. So the actual access is very, very limited. But so many outlets have done very serious investigative work from a distance, or a combination of you know, online research, leaked documents, interviews with very brave Uyghurs outside of China, and then combine that with, you know, some on-the-ground reporting that's been done inside of China to, you know, to put together a picture of what's happening there. And there has, I wouldn't say it was not until the last really 6 months have you seen a dramatic you know, response by the Chinese government. And that really only came after the US began restricting Chinese state media outlets and Chinese journalists in the US. You know, that's when, you know, most notably almost all of the American journalists at the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post were expelled. But it wasn't necessarily directly in response to these reports, although certainly some people, like Megan Rajagopal with BuzzFeed, was basically expelled from China, probably because of her Xinjiang reporting and others. So there is still space for that, but it is with the recent expulsions and with the incredibly rapid deterioration of U.S.-China ties, I do see that space getting smaller. And I will say that I have myself felt the impact of the expulsion of I think this year there's been 16 U.S. national journalists who've been kicked out, and then also Chris Buckley, who's an Australian with the New York Times. Maybe more than, at least those 17. There's still other people doing some good work, but we are seeing a greater difficulty. But we have also seen the Chinese government react to some of the other methods. So, for example, Adrian Zenz spent an incredible amount of his own personal time getting documents off of that were just publicly available, on local Chinese government websites, and downloading those documents into a massive database and then analyzing them. Bless that man. Now we are seeing fewer documents put online. After the publication of both the New York Times, the Xinjiang papers, and then the ICIJ's China cables, I believe the AP reported that in Xinjiang, a directive had gone out to, burn the files, break the computers, a leak hunt, a huge leak hunt, and then future regulations to vastly reduce the number of people who have access to sensitive information. And even I believe there was some directives going out saying don't collect just don't even have it exist. Let's just stop collecting certain kinds of information so that information then cannot be leaked. So there are definite responses from the Chinese government to make it more difficult to know what's happening in China. I would like to ask a question, if that's okay, and I would like to ask Tang Yao, as someone who has spent a lot of time now outside of China, while actively observing what's happening there, actively observing the civil society, I would like to know what you have seen from a distance as the Chinese government has gotten more and more totalitarian. What have you seen from Chinese people in their own response and knowledge about what's happening in Xinjiang?
Of course, it's more difficult for Chinese people living in China to get information, the true information about Xinjiang. It's the most sensitive issue in China, and so as I said, the brainwashing is really effective in China. I was brainwashed before I went to university. So I know many Chinese people in China and outside China. They just hate Uyghurs, hate Muslim, and without meeting a single Muslim. So they never met a Uyghur, but they just claim that Uyghurs, Muslims are separatists or terrorists. And I have some relatives in Xinjiang, and when I talk about the recent policies in Xinjiang, and they are really supportive. They said it's good because the social stability is better, and like the criminals, the thieves dare not to go out to commit crimes. So that's and many Chinese people share that kind of idea. So I think when Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party tightened its control on media, on internet, universities, and NGOs, it's getting more and more hard to for the Chinese people to be enlightened, and of course, even for other part of China, it's more difficult to mobilize a protest, or even like the human rights lawyers and activists. We did have space to develop our rights defense movement during Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao era, but now it's not likely. The risk is much higher than before.
I just want to add one quick point, because on my WeChat, I do have a lot of Chinese professors and Chinese lawyers. And I used to see, like, some of the articles that they would share and their moments that were critical of the Chinese government. But I think over the past few years, I've never seen anything. Like, their moments were empty, or like they have like this, you can only share like up to like 3 links, but that's it. But then it automatically, after 3 days, it would get deleted as well. And it just goes to show like how much information they're controlling. And even like law professors, not human rights law professors, just regular law professors, they're even like scared of, who used to be a bit of like, at least dare to share these materials, like now like refraining from even engaging in that kind of like, mini discourse.
Thank you very much for that. We're nearing the end of our time. I want to apologize if we haven't gotten to all of the questions that have been submitted. I just wanted to ask our panel, we've got a very large amount of questions that are essentially asking, what can we do? What can we do on college campuses? That sort of thing. I wanted to see if you had any final thoughts on what recommendations you would have.
Can I jump in really quick and just say, if you're on a college campus, hold an event about Xinjiang, just like who, what, when, where, why, what is happening. And there's 2 reasons for that. But most importantly, it's just to increase awareness. But second, I think it's really important for universities to act in concert, because if you look, for example, at the Dalai Lama and how China has pressured US universities and universities around the world not to invite him, it becomes an accepted thing that, oh, that's sensitive, I better not do it. And everyone has kind of stopped to do it, not everyone, but it's harder to do that. But if universities choose to act in concert and to have many, many events around a sensitive topic, there's very little that the Chinese government can do. It can't pressure 100 universities at once. So if you're on, if you're on this call and you're at a university, doesn't matter who you are, you can hold an event about this.
I have 2 quick points. One thing is business. So many global Western business involved in the forced labor, and including many famous brands. And I remember last year, when being asked about the concentration camps in Xinjiang, and the CEO of Volkswagen said he didn't know. So I think we can really give pressure to these these companies, if they keep silent, if they are involving in the forced labors of the concentration camps, and that's one effective way we can take. And another thing is 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics. I have seen some organizations, some scholars have linked the Xinjiang issue to Olympics, and that's one of the few things that the international community can really give pressure to Chinese government, because that's really something that Beijing cares, and we should call for boycotting Beijing Olympics.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think that's true. I would just second what Bethany had said. This also leads back to what Reihan was saying about college campuses. Of course, now we're in a situation where who knows what kinds of events will be happening on college campuses this coming semester. But especially with regards to Chinese students, I've had a number of Chinese students who have come up to me, maybe not always on this issue, maybe on other ones related to human rights or propaganda, that, after hearing me speak or seeing a panel, they kind of quietly came up afterwards and they were like, wow, I never heard anybody talk about that like that before. And, there are a lot of Chinese who want to learn more and want to hear. And I think especially when people see the personal accounts of folks who have, family members who are in detention or have personally gone through things, I think that could be really powerful. I think the other thing would be, when you see some information that really strikes you, to share it, because I think also that was really, I think somebody was asking a question about, how to talk to Chinese relatives. I think again, there's lots of different information, and so maybe you feel in your senses that your Chinese relatives, maybe they won't believe something that's in the New York Times, but maybe you go to one of the links that like Adrian Zenz had found, and it's an archived page from a Chinese government website talking about what's been done, to Uyghur women, and that, seems like something that your relative might be able to see for themselves and say, what do you, this is what's really happening, and it's much harder for them, to refute and just get people thinking. Because one of the things we've seen with the China Media Bulletin project that I work on is we publish it in Chinese as well as English, and just, a lot of it is just kind of following different tactics and of developments related to surveillance and censorship. And when we do surveys with readers, so many of the Chinese readers say, just understanding better how the system works helps them, protect themselves, but also be more interested in seeking out uncensored information. And there are lots of academic studies that show that too. So just, that little tidbit can be enough to really, especially for people who are outside China or have access to a more free information environment, they start searching, and then that opens a whole new way of thinking. And I think using sometimes our wisdom to think about what strikes us, and what we think might, be of interest to somebody else is really useful. And then I think the other thing I would say is, when you're looking and you're reading the local media, I'm not talking about Chinese state media, but if, depending what languages you speak, what newspapers you subscribe to, and you see something that's problematic, whether it's in how they're depicting the Uyghurs, whether it's in that they're running a paid supplement, especially if you're paying for a subscription, then dropping a note to the subscription saying, I just saw this and I was on this article and I clicked through and it took me to the China Watch website. This really bothers me as a subscriber. I think that's also kind of a grassroots way of putting pressure on different media and outlets that are channeling some of this content. Even if it sometimes appears alongside really good reporting, but it might be to put pressure on the parts of those media outlets that are looking more from the business side.
I'll just suggest a student-led coalition group, whether it could be an affinity group, like Southeast Asian students support for the Uyghurs, or UCLA students group supporting Uyghur genocide. So I think there are so many things that students can do. And I think this is another body that the Chinese government is incredibly afraid, because think about it, all Chinese official sons and daughters study in these universities. Despite how much they dislike Western democracy and all our values, they do love sending their kids to universities across America or in Europe. So I think that kind of support is very much needed. And I can speak on behalf of the Uyghur community, Uyghur people here. So make sure create a student-led coalition and help us to amplify our voice.
Thank you very much for all those great suggestions. We've come to the end of our time today. I would like to thank all of our panelists and recommend our audience, if they are on Twitter, you can find all of our panelists on Twitter, as well as UHRP in English and Chinese. And I recommend you go to our website as well, if you haven't already. We have more suggestions about what you can do in addition to all of our research, including our most recent report on disinformation. And you can also sign up to our mailing list so you can stay informed about our future projects and events. Again, thank you all so much. Thank you everyone for attending. And this will be available as a video later. So. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Yeah, please feel free to reach out. Bye.